We're delighted to have Dean Glenn Hubbard and Tim Kane tonight to discuss why powerful nations and civilizations break down under the heavy burden of economic imbalance and why America could be next. As many of you know, Dean Hubbard has co-authored a number of books and remains prolific. These books have included The Healthcare System, covered in Healthy, Wealthy, and Wise with John Cogan and Daniel Kessler, the role of business development in Africa in The Aid Trap, Hard Truths About Ending Poverty with Professor William Duggan, and has most recently taken on an even broader topic with balance. He joins forces and found a great partnership with co-author Tim Kane in the creation of this latest book. Tim is the chief economist at the Hudson Institute. He is also an active entrepreneur and investor, having founded multiple software firms. In addition to senior research roles at the Kaufman Foundation and the Heritage Foundation, Kane has served twice as a senior economist at the Joint Economic Committees of the U.S. Congress. Tim and Dean Hubbard blog at balanceofeconomics.com. That's balanceofeconomics.com. Tim also authored Bleeding Talent, a book about leadership in the U.S. military that has been favorably reviewed by the New York Times and the National Review. More information on both Dean Hubbard and Tim Kane can be found on the information sheets that you have on your chair. Without further ado, I am going to ask Dean Hubbard and Tim Kane to speak a little bit about their partnership and about the book. And then we are going to move to a question and answer session. I have a few questions up my sleeve, but I welcome you to start thinking about any questions you might have about this very important subject. So, Dean Hubbard, why don't you begin?
Thank you. Thanks, Janet. Thanks, everybody, for coming out tonight to talk about the book with Tim and me. Tim and I are radicals. I know we may not look like radicals sitting here tonight, but I think we are radicals because the book is not one of the many tomes that explains why decline is inevitable for the United States. In fact, it's quite the opposite. We are a say no to the decline school for America. The book, though, is radical as well, though, in that we claim we have an answer, a roadmap to what causes great powers to decline, that it's a bit like a clinician looking at a series of patients and spotting common symptoms and then treating them. And then finally, we try to offer some very specific ways out for the U.S. to avoid some of the historical fates. Economists tend to get really excited about explaining economic growth. But this book and books about stumbling of great powers are different than that because we're about explaining why growth stops, which may sound to many economists like much less fun, but is in fact much more important. And to set the stage, I'd like you to imagine with Tim and me tonight that you're standing in 1913 on the verge, let's say, of soon to happen World War I. The per capita income in today's dollars in much of the industrial world was a little over $3,000 at the time. If you were fortunate enough to be an American, it was about $1,000 higher. If you were to dial the clock back from 1913 to the year 1000 in the Common Era, that number would be about $400 in per capita income in today's money. But what's more interesting is if you dial the clock way back to Augustan Rome, people were better off than they were in that subsequent period. And the question is, what happened to Rome? Now, here's where historians have weighed in many, many times that what happened to Rome was classic overstretch, an empire that had its reach exceed its grasp, and we know what happened. That's not our view. Our view is that what happened to Rome and what happened to many great powers that we look at was rather more akin to understretch, politics not keeping up with economics, and looking inward rather than looking outward. The great view of all this from historians was a book about 25 years ago by Paul Kennedy called The Rise and Decline of Nations. It's a classic overstretch thesis. And what caught Tim's and my attention about Kennedy's book, I'm one of those people, when I read The New Yorker, I really read the cartoons. And so the same thing in Kennedy's book, what first caught my attention was the cover. And on the cover was the globe with a set of people crossing it. And somebody had already stumbled off the globe, and it was John Bull, the symbol of the United Kingdom. The person who was beginning to stumble was none other than Uncle Sam. And guess who was arising transformative at the top of the globe? It was Japan. This book was 1987. I was skeptical at the time in textbooks about that, and I think that Paul Kennedy was not alone. There were many economists trumpeting Japan's ultimate rise, and indeed, probably the biggest symbol of this decline and fall comes from Paul Samuelson's famous textbook, where for many editions, the Soviet Union was predicted to overtake the United States. With each edition, that date kept slipping. In the 1989 edition, for reasons that are probably familiar, it simply disappeared from the text. So even the greatest economists have struggled with this notion. Tim and I looked at a lot of case studies in the book. We're very fond of Rome as a starter, but we also looked at Ming China as a period in which great exploration had China the envy of the world, only to see inward lookingness kill that. We looked at the Ottoman Empire, which, as a surprise to probably a lot of people, was actually very outward and inclusive and diverse until taken over by rent-seeking from internal forces. We do look at Japan through the lens of the game of Go. And for those of you who are Go fanatics, you know at the beginning it's like a blank slate, anything is possible. The end is kind of predetermined. The middle's where the fun is, and that's what we argue Japan is struggling with today. We looked at the British Empire's decline through the lens of, again, inward lookingness, the failure to make more people British. It was a small part of the world in 1776 that noticed that. It was noticed many times in the British Empire. We also talk about some contemporary examples in Europe and in the state of California. But what we really had in mind in thinking about the book was the contemporary United States. The U.S. is fundamentally imbalanced. It is imbalanced in the gap between its interest in the present and consumption in the present versus its interest in the future. And indeed, a great symbol of this is what has happened to the budget in the United States. If you were to look prior to 1970 and plot the federal debt to GDP ratio over time from the revolution to 1970, what do you suppose the picture would look like? Not numbers, just shapes. It would look like... Yes, it's war and peace. Not just for the United States. I could have said Britain, I could have said France. Prior to about 1970, debt tended to rise in wartime. In peacetime, when military spending fell, economic growth resumed, debt to GDP ratios declined. After 1970, the rise of very large spending in Social Security and Medicare, principally in the US, but social welfare spending throughout the industrial world really increased debt to GDP ratios substantially. Where Tim and I come down on this is that this is not a book about policy or even a book particularly about economics. We don't see that this is an economic problem. We see it as a political problem, that we had a system, and indeed each of these great powers had a system that was too polarized to deal with the problem that was right in front of its eyes. Now, I promised you we had a quick way to get out of it, and it's really about three things. The standard economist joke, which you have to understand to be able to get out of America's problems, the game of basketball, and reading the Odyssey. Now, I can look at you all and tell that economics was your favorite class in college. You just have that look to me. And you remember the classic economist joke, which Tim and I hate because we're economists, but it's instructive for this point. Never heard it. So the classic economist joke is, of course, the economist, the chemist, and the physicist are marooned on a desert island, and a can of soup washes ashore. And the chemist says, let's just, we'll heat it up, and it will explode, we'll eat it. The physicist says, no, we'll just beat it open, and the economist proverbially